Hello and welcome to our webinar this evening, afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Tom Wittig and I would like to welcome everybody. And without further ado, let's get started with our topic today. So the topic today is about systemic project management. And the subtitle is how to plan, manage, deliver, and manage projects with systemic insight. This is not a new topic. This is something I started to working on quite some time ago, but fairly recently, I prepared some webinars to share my work in this field or in this part of the field with a broader audience. So the topics for today I want to share in this compact webinar. First, I want to talk about some of the systemic dimensions of project management and get us basically grounded again. What are we talking about? Then I would like to share an example. I brought today an example of a constellation I was leading about an escalating project, and I would like to share some insights from that piece of work about how to de-escalate a project and how to integrate some systemic insight in this challenging situation. Then I will share some of the resources, so where you can find some more topics, and if time permits, we also have usually some time for an open Q&A if you have a question. This webinar will be recorded, so you should receive a link to the recording. Make sure to access the link. If you miss that, I usually upload the recording to the resource library for organizational constellations, which you can find on the website. If you follow constellateur.com and go to the courses section, there you will see a free resource library, but I will talk about that later on. Okay, so this is a compact webinar, so usually I'm trying to keep it closer to the 15-minute, 20 minutes mark, plus some Q&A, and I hope we can manage to do that today. So first of all, let me talk a little bit more about some of the systemic perspectives about projects. But first of all, we need to ask, what is a project? That's the multi-million-dollar quiz question. I usually ask that every time we work on this topic. And what is a project? And to provide the answer right away, projects have a definitive start date and typically also an end date. And that distinguishes a project, for example, from an ongoing program. A program is typically something that is going on, which does not have a specific end date. And there are other efforts in organizations, for example, ongoing campaigns. You see that very often in marketing. And so a project is really something that has a finite start and end date in which we are trying to accomplish something. So what the project typically starts at a starting point when somebody says, okay, the project is about to start and it has some target. And the target is typically, first of all, defined by a schedule. So this is one of the components that we find in any project, in a well-defined project. There should be a schedule of when things happen and when the project is about to complete. So this little runner here is moving towards this target, and this is the target date by which the project is complete. And this alone is already a stress factor for many projects, because typically many projects are planned fairly aggressive, so that a target day has been set. For example, the client wants to move into the new building, for example, or a new product needs to be developed in order to be launched into the market, etc. The other dimension that we are interested in is basically the budget or the resources that we have available. So during the course of the project, we spend more and more and more resources on delivering the project. For example, personnel resources. So in project management language, we count this in person days. But of course, this also has a financial component because we need to pay salaries for the people involved. As long as we are staying within the budget and within the time frame, the project is feasible. And if we have enough resources and if we have enough time, we call this project feasible, which means, yes, it can be done. And that is, by the way, one simple question you could ask a project manager or a client who has a project. Do you have a feasible plan? And most of the time people ask, okay, what does it mean, feasible plan? Can you explain that a little bit more? Feasible basically means that your objectives, your schedule, and your budget are in balance. If it's out of balance, you are ending in these danger zones. So here you are suffering from a schedule overrun that hits many, many projects. And I can say also the rule is that the larger the project is, the larger in scope and the more complex it is, the more likely it is that the project will run over schedule. On the upper part here, the project is running over budget, which means you are exceeding your budget. That also happens often when there is, for example, a change in the amount of work that has to be done during the project, which we call typically a scope change. A really problematic area is if you are up here in this, I would call it the Bermuda area. So that's where a lot of projects actually disappear sometimes, when you have to deal with a project that is running out of the schedule, out of the budget, and is completely in escalation mode. And then the question is, how can you rein that project in? How can you bring it under control? In what is typical in these areas, there is not only a lot of panic happening, but there are a lot of unfortunate and unfavorable dynamics going on, sometimes a vicious cycle where, for example, where you're running late, people have to work overtime, they make more errors, which means you need to spend even more work on your project in order to accomplish it. So it's a vicious cycle that is often happening in projects. So the question is also, how can we take a look at this from a perspective of or from a systemic perspective, when we, for example, apply our systemic head to this? And from a systemic perspective, we need to recognize that there are these two areas. So one is our rational mind, which is making decisions about numbers, about facts, such as a budget, a schedule, a scope. And on the other side, we have to deal with the relationship dynamics. Here we talk about things such as the stakeholders, the clients, the donors of the project, or sometimes called the executive sponsors of the project, but also communication, interpersonal communication, project communication, stakeholder communication, for example. The team and the team spirit. A few days ago, I gave a webinar about team spirit, how you can lose and regain a team spirit. So you may want to check out this webinar as well. And of course, the work culture. In my observation, and I think I share this with many people who have managed fairly complex projects, if you have an appropriate work culture, which is in tune with what you're trying to accomplish, then the project is usually flowing very well. If you have a toxic work culture, then that is also introducing a higher error fraction. So when I'm working with the client, I'm not only checking budget, scope, and schedule, but I'm taking a look at the systemic aspects. What is the nature of the work culture? How do people communicate? What are the relationships between the key players, of course? So this these repercussions between the rational dynamics and the relationship dynamics, that's what makes project dynamics so interesting, but also fairly challenging to manage for many project managers and teams. So when we when we say scope, schedule, and budget, what do we mean? Scope basically means what needs to be developed and what is the quality of the project that we want to produce. What is the amount of things that we want to produce? Schedule is when does it need to happen? What is the sequence of things? And when is the completion date of a project, for example? And budget is typically the question around how many people, how much money, how many other resources, how much material actually do we need to bring into a project, for example. So let's talk a little bit more about the systemic feedback because that's the main topic for this particular course or webinar. We're not talking about the classic project management, but more about the systemic feedback. And I think there are two things that we need to keep in mind. First is a quantitative feedback. And here we are talking about, let's say, a bundle of cause and effect relationships. For example, when basically when you're increasing your scope, you're increasing your budget, that has an impact on the work pressure. And more pressure generates more errors, which means you need to allocate more budget because more work needs to be done. So these are feedback loops, and they can be reinforcing feedback loops, or they can be balancing feedback loops. Reinforcing feedback loops typically drive a project development, so drive an escalation moment in project development. For example, an escalation of cost, an escalation of problems, errors, and rework that has to be done. While a balancing feedback loop is typically bringing the system in control again. So an example for a balancing feedback loop is the more work you get, the more work gets done and completed, the lower the stress level and the lower the error rate is going to be. So you see that in the final phases often of a well-managed project, that the error rate is actually going down, where it is climbing up in the beginning, but at the end it's going down. Other systemic feedback includes accumulation and delay. Oftentimes, the effects of some of the causes are delayed, and sometimes they show up in a very different part of the project. So delays and accumulation account also for our misjudgment and misestimation about what is really happening. For example, when we believe that a lot of work has been done, but there's an accumulation of hidden errors in our work, that typically triggers a reworking cycle, which is then increasing the pressure on the project team. A very common scenario. A simple way to find out about this is to ask the project manager, what is the amount of rework that you have factored into your plan? That's a very rational question, but it has tremendous impact on the systemic feedback and also on the relationships, of course. A different perspective is if we take a look at the project from a relationship perspective. So here I'm choosing my virtual representatives for, let's say, a systemic constellation. And sometimes when I'm working with a client, and I'm unfolding here an example of my my work recently, sometimes I'm choosing the systemic constellation. And sometimes I don't even tell the client. No? So we just choose representatives, and I say, okay, this fellow here is representing scope. This is representing budget and schedule and budget. No? So in a systemic constellation, in-person constellation, I'm choosing people to represent these factors. No? And as a first step, I say, okay, you go with your own movement, or I put them into some kind of a known order that people can relate to. The known order for a project manager is called this project triangle of scope, budget, and schedule. That's what many people know. So that is actually a good starting point also to initiate the work of a systemic constellation, especially if I don't want to make a lot of dance around what is a systemic constellation. But this is a good starting point. And then I'm choosing some stakeholders. For example, in this case, I chose the customer, who is the recipient of the project, and the end user, who is the beneficiary of the project or the deliverable of the project. So this can sometimes be, for example, a government customer, and the end user can be the citizen. Or in a municipality, for example, the people who live in that municipality. And then I choose employees, and also a little bit lighter shade here, the suppliers. So suppliers are typically external suppliers who provide material or services sometimes. So for example, when you're building a house, you need to have an architect, you need to have people who measure things, and things like that. So that could be a supplier, for example. And then I tell them to move with their inner emotion, or I am positioning them in the way that it makes sense, that it resonates with the project, with the perception of how the relationships actually happen. So in this scenario, I position the employees basically facing outwards. They're running away together with the suppliers. Typically, the suppliers are the first one to leave a project, and that is already a warning sign. So this could be a warning sign of a project which is going into risk, into a risk mode. And so a project like risk, in this case, for example, it looked like this. So the employees are moving out and the scope is retreating, which means that we're dealing with an unfeasible project. So the scope is moving away and the customer is just focusing on the schedule. So when does the project need to get done? So when I'm clarifying a situation like this, it already gives me some indications. It gives me some insights where to look at. Of course, you could run after the employees and say, hey, come back, and it's not so bad, etc. But that usually doesn't work. So you need to find let's say a better leverage point or a starting point for your intervention. Now, in this case, I went with the scope, and basically what I tested out in this scenario was that I put in a representative for the requirements. So then, of course, the client is asking, the client for the constellation is asking, okay, what does it mean? What do I have to do? So I have to explain a little bit more how this could be helpful. In this case, I explained that defining a requirements engineer, for example, to work with the client is the starting point to clarify the scope. So, but it doesn't start from, let's say, a spreadsheet or a list, a piece of paper. It starts with the relationship to the client. So I'm giving the client something that is needed in order to bring the relationship in balance and the project components in balance again. So this is just an extract from one of the examples. And I increasingly like the integration of using constellations or systemic constellations together with other systemic tools and the classics of project management. And I believe that this is a good way of integrating the systemic work in ongoing organizational constellations, business constellations, and where things get also a little bit more technical, because we have to also get into resonance with our clients. We have to appeal to the rational mind, but also to the inner movement of the organization. And it's amazing how you can quickly surface these insights with a constellation. So in this case, what are the systemic leverage points? a couple of things, or let's say in general speaking. First of all is client orientation. Client orientation means that we are facing towards the client, and first we have to figure out who is really the client of the project. Is it the person we are talking to? Is it a beneficiary of the project or a donor? So we have to find that out and interrogate that and investigate that further. Then, of course, the stakeholder relationships provide the primary point. No? So especially when it is about communication as another key angle, but communication is typically a reflection of the relationship between the stakeholders. So when I'm asking and when I'm conducting the systemic discovery, I typically ask, what are you typically talking about? What is the topic of your meetings right now? What is the key concerns that you hear from the stakeholders? So we can surface this in a very natural dialogue, actually. Then, of course, the work culture. If there's a work culture that is, let's say, pointed towards driving people to do more overtime, etc., that is also not very healthy for the organization. And it's also very toxic for the quality of the work that is being done. So that is important. Now, many projects have to run with some overtime for some time, but then later on, if people are running out of resources, running out of overtime, and they're throwing more people into the project typically runs late. It's a well-known phenomenon that adding people to a late project makes the project actually later. And I believe that also has to do with some systemic aspects, because people need to first find their place in their organization. It's not only about bringing in good engineers and project managers, but this is about human person-to-person relationships that we are looking at. And last but not least, of course, leadership is a key topic, and that may be a topic for a future webinar, which I have in mind for a little bit later this year, talking about leadership in the sense of projects. Okay, so that was a bit of introduction for today. Before I take a look if there are some questions in the questions in the chat tab or in the Q&A, I wanted to point you to some additional resources. So this is now the third episode in this series. Meanwhile, I delivered about 35-ish or so webinars during the pandemic. So there's actually something good in the pandemic. We get to talk about more content. And in this series about project management, you may want to start with this one, which is about some basics for project management from a systemic perspective. Last time I talked about project recovery, and today also I brought this together with another example from managing projects. Fairly recently, I led some online seminars also using this new way of working, and this is something where I'm drawing a lot of examples from the people who are participating. Forthcoming is another insight journey. So insight journeys are free guided meditations, and sometimes I'm throwing in some bonus episodes from the podcast. So from the webinar. So the insight journey is a podcast which is freely available. You can find it on wherever you find good podcasts, like Apple, Amazon, Google, and Spotify, and many others. And so upcoming a little bit later this year will be a topic about systemic project management. So make sure to check out constellateur.com, especially the upcoming webinar or seminar sections. If you have a question about this topic, you can also reach me by sending an email or sending your experience about this topic. So the resource library is basically a free collection of these kind of webinars. Sometimes I'm also sharing the presentation from this webinar plus some additional audio. So you can sign up for this. It's actually free. You can download some material. And today I demonstrated the use of the Constellation canvas. I am using this more and more in virtual constellations now. The past weekend, I gave a bigger seminar with a group of people from China, fairly big group, and we used the constellation canvas to work on online family and organizational constellation. So there's a free course. You can look for this on the website. It's a very compact course, 16 video lessons or so, and it's free, so you can also download the template. All right, so that was the presentation part. Let me check and let's say stop the sharing here and see if we have some questions from the audience today. Okay, interesting theme. Thank you for that, Daud. What about consulting without constellation? Not sure if I understand the question correctly. Of course, you can consult without constellation. No? So there are many people who do project consulting. Actually, I'm doing project consulting in different ways. Sometimes people want to have, let's say, a little bit more fact-oriented things, or they want to understand why is their project running out of control. Sometimes people are at the end of their project management skills, and then they want to get a different perspective. So they want to understand. Typically, they come and say, we tried everything, but we can't get this project under control. Can you give us some guidance, or what are other ways how we can take a look at this? And then I'm bringing in a different perspective with systemic constellations. And I would encourage you to also integrate that in your work and try it out in a specific situation. It doesn't have to be a massive project like building the Berlin airport, which is known to run very late again and again, but it can be a small topic, especially, for example, when people are building a business, new career, etc. Keep in mind, a project typically has a start date and an end date. And this is a special situation, which also often creates a lot of stress. Okay, so another question is to be systematic. I guess the correction is here to be systemic. Do you need to use the constellation as a starting point or not necessarily? So as I tried to explain, there are different ways and approaches of working in a systemic way. No? I'm using actually two major different perspectives when it comes to systemic work. One is the family constellation or the constellation work, which I demonstrated here. Another one is about system dynamics modeling, which is a quantitative way of modeling complex systems with feedback loops, so-called stock and flow diagrams, and so on. Also, there's another way of finding out about a systemic risk in projects. So sometimes I'm doing project risk modeling, and that can give also an interesting input for the project managers. For example, about the inherent risk and uncertainty in a project. Because when you can combine that with the relationship level, you often have a complete view about what is happening on the relationship level and also what is driving it. So where's the uncertainty coming from? Where is the schedule pressure coming from? No? So, but that's fairly sophisticated. So I think you need to be well versed in different tools. No? But you can actually approach it in a different way. Often people ask me, okay, how should I get started with a systemic constellation when I'm working with the client? My best answer for that is typically be your first client, work with yourself first, inform your decisions, and then integrate this in your management practices, in your consulting practices, in your coaching practices. Oftentimes, I believe that's challenging when you come in a project situation and then you say, oh, let's first make a constellation. Huh? first of all, you're meeting people who have no experience with that, and you might actually run into a lot of resistance. But if you're informing your approach, your consulting coaching approach with systemic constellation, working with the client and not really talking much about it, I think you are naturally getting into this way of working with the constellations. Okay, so that was the Q&A part. There's one more comment in the chat. I just would like to thank you one more time for the kindly opportunity. You're very welcome, Fabiani. This is a service for the field. Yeah, so we need to make sure that we stay connected, and I'm very happy to share things from my work. I hope it is useful for you, and that it also brings some good things in and good quality in your work, in your coaching, in your consulting. So I believe I have captured all the questions today. I want to thank you for joining. And there will be a slightly different topic next time, which is more about our ancestors. That's a little bit different topic. So the organizational constellation work will, of course, continue with future webinars. So wishing you good luck, and see you in a week or two for the next webinar. Take care.